World War I is remembered as a war of trenches, barbed wire, and sacrifice. What it is not remembered as is a war where men drowned in their own fluids, while medical officers recorded their deaths as pneumonia, where soldiers were executed for cowardice after their eardrums had ruptured from shelling, where the human body became a logistical problem measured in cubic feet of trench space. The Great War was not sanitized during the conflict. It was sanitized afterward, when the survivors were too tired to correct the record and the dead could not speak. What remains in textbooks is a curated version of events. What was removed is a documentation of industrialized human decay on a scale that required new filing systems just to keep track of the casualties. This is not about forgotten battles. This is about what happens when an entire generation is fed into a machine that runs on bureaucracy and attrition, and the machine is never turned off. The first truth involves the smell. Every account of trench warfare mentions mud, gas, and smoke. Very few mention that the Western Front could be smelled from miles away during summer months. The odor was not metaphorical. It was a documented phenomenon that affected supply lines, morale, and the psychological state of incoming reinforcements. Trenches were dug through soil already saturated with human remains from earlier battles. When it rained, the earth released gases from decomposing bodies that had been buried in shallow graves or not buried at all. Soldiers described the smell as sweet, rotten, and inescapable. It clung to uniforms, saturated food, and made breathing through the nose impossible in some sectors. Medical officers noted that men arriving at the front for the first time would vomit for hours, not from fear, but from the smell alone. This was not included in recruitment materials. It was not included in letters home, which were read by censors who redacted any mention of conditions that might affect public morale. The smell of the Western Front was a strategic concern because it indicated the presence of mass death in concentrations that violated pre-war assumptions about how battles were supposed to function. Commanders requested lime shipments not for construction, but to cover the dead. The requests were logged, approved, and filed without comment. The second truth involves the rats. Trench rats were not scavengers in the traditional sense. They were an occupying force. Rats in the trenches grew to the size of cats because they fed on human corpses. They were not afraid of soldiers. They would crawl over sleeping men, bite the wounded, and enter dugouts in groups large enough to overwhelm anyone too injured to fight them off. Soldiers were issued clubs specifically for killing rats, and it was common for sentries to spend the night hitting rats instead of watching for enemy movement. The rats spread disease, contaminated food supplies, and contributed to infection rates that killed more men than some battles. Gas attacks would kill the rats temporarily, but they returned within days, larger and more numerous. There are documented cases of men refusing to sleep because the rats would bite their faces. There are reports of wounded soldiers being partially consumed by rats before stretcher bearers could reach them. The rats were not a footnote. They were part of the operational reality of trench warfare, mentioned in after-action reports and supply requests, but never in public dispatches. The British Army purchased thousands of terriers to control the rat population. It did not work. The rats adapted faster than the terriers could kill them. The third truth involves what happened to bodies in no man's land. When soldiers were killed during an assault, their bodies remained where they fell. Retrieving them was not always possible. Daylight movement in no man's land meant death, and night recovery missions were only authorized when the tactical situation allowed. In sectors where fighting was continuous, bodies remained in place for weeks or months. They became part of the landscape. Soldiers used corpses as landmarks for navigation. Reports describe dead men propped against wire, used as markers for patrol routes. The bodies decomposed in stages. First they bloated, then they burst, then they dried into shapes that no longer resembled human beings. Rain would partially rehydrate them. Winter would freeze them into positions that looked like sculptures. Soldiers stopped seeing them as people. They became objects, obstacles, part of the terrain. New arrivals would ask about the bodies. Veterans would not answer. There was no answer. The bodies were there because retrieving them cost more lives, and the arithmetic did not justify the effort. Commanders were aware of this. Chaplains were aware of this. The decision was made at every level that the dead would stay where they were, and the war would continue over them. Some sectors had so many corpses in no man's land that soldiers could walk across them without touching the ground. This is not an exaggeration. This is in the written record, buried in unit diaries and medical reports that were classified until the men who wrote them were dead. The fourth truth involves trench foot. The condition is mentioned in most histories of the war, but the descriptions are sanitized. Trench foot was not discomfort. It was necrosis. Soldiers stood in waterlogged trenches for days or weeks at a time, their boots filled with water, their socks rotted, their feet swelled until the skin split. The tissue underneath would turn black and begin to die. In severe cases, the flesh would fall away from the bone. The smell was identifiable even among the other smells of the trench. Men with trench foot could not walk. They could not wear boots. They had to be carried to aid stations, where medical officers would cut away the dead tissue with scalpels and no anesthetic, because the supply chain could not keep up with demand. Some men lost toes. Some lost feet. Some lost legs. The condition was entirely preventable. Dry socks and boot rotation would have stopped it. But dry socks required supply infrastructure that did not exist, and boot rotation required relief schedules that would have reduced the number of men in the line. The decision was made repeatedly to accept trench foot casualties as the cost of maintaining trench strength. Orders were issued requiring soldiers to change their socks daily. The socks were not provided. Men were court-martialed for self-inflicted wounds when their trench foot became severe enough to require evacuation. The logic was that they had failed to follow orders, and failure to follow orders was indiscipline, and indiscipline in wartime was cowardice. The records show men executed for cowardice whose medical files documented advanced trench foot. The records also show that these files were not presented at trial. The fifth truth involves lice. Every soldier in the trenches had lice. This was not a hygiene failure. This was a biological inevitability. Lice lived in the seams of uniforms where they couldn't be reached by scratching. They laid eggs faster than they could be killed. Soldiers would run candle flames along the seams of their uniforms to burn the lice out. The lice would die. The eggs would hatch. New lice would appear within hours. The itching was constant. It affected concentration, sleep, and mental stability. Men would scratch themselves until they bled, and the blood would attract more lice. Lice carried typhus. Typhus killed thousands of soldiers in conditions that were recorded as fever or pneumonia, because typhus implied poor sanitation, and poor sanitation implied command failure. The lice were not a morale problem. They were a medical crisis that was redefined as a morale problem because there was no solution. Delousing stations were set up behind the lines. Soldiers would be ordered to strip, and their uniforms would be baked in ovens while the men were hosed down with chemical solutions. The process killed most of the lice. The soldiers would put their uniforms back on, return to the trenches, and be reinfested within a day. The lice were already in the trenches. They were in the wood. They were in the sandbags. They were in the straw used for bedding. Killing the lice on the soldiers did nothing to address the lice in the environment, but the delousing continued because it created the appearance of action. Reports were filed. Inspections were conducted. The lice continued. The sixth truth involves what shellfire does to the human body. High explosive shells do not kill cleanly. They kill through overpressure, fragmentation, and blunt force trauma. A shell landing in a trench does not create individual casualties. It creates a cloud of vaporized human tissue mixed with dirt, wood, and metal. Men close to the detonation are not killed. They cease to exist as intact organisms. What remains is distributed across the trench in pieces too small to identify. Soldiers describe finding a boot with a foot still in it, a section of rib cage, a lower jaw with teeth. The pieces were collected and buried in mass graves because individual identification was impossible. Shells that landed near a trench but did not directly hit it would still kill through overpressure. The blast wave would rupture internal organs without leaving external marks. Men would be found dead, with no visible wounds. Autopsies revealed that their lungs had been turned to liquid, their intestines had ruptured, and their brains had hemorrhaged. This was recorded as concussion. The term made it sound like a temporary condition. It was not temporary. Overpressure deaths were instant and irreversible, but they did not fit the narrative of soldiers dying heroically in combat, so the medical terminology was adjusted to obscure the mechanism of death. Families were told their sons had been killed by shell fire. They were not told that their sons had been liquefied, fragmented, or asphyxiated by their own blood. The seventh truth involves the use of soldiers as construction material. Trench systems required constant maintenance. Parapets collapsed, dugouts flooded, communication trenches eroded. The materials used for construction were wood, sandbags, and whatever else was available. In some sectors, what was available were bodies. Corpses were used to reinforce trench walls because they were plentiful, required no transportation, and were already in position. Soldiers would stack bodies like sandbags and cover them with dirt. The practice was not official policy. It was a field expedient adopted independently in multiple sectors because it worked. Dead men do not complain. They do not require rations. They do not get tired. Engineers noted that corpses made effective structural fill because they compacted well and did not shift once the decomposition process stabilized. The practice was not reported up the chain of command because it did not need to be. The goal was to maintain the trench. The method was irrelevant. When trenches were abandoned, the bodies remained in the walls. When trenches were recaptured, new soldiers would occupy positions reinforced with the bodies of old soldiers. This was discovered during post-war recovery efforts, when construction crews found human remains embedded in trench walls in numbers that exceeded battlefield casualty reports. The discrepancy was noted and filed. No investigation was conducted. The eighth truth involves what gas attacks actually did. Poison gas was not a quick death, it was a process. Chlorine gas would burn the respiratory system, causing the lungs to fill with fluid. Soldiers would drown in their own secretions over a period of hours or days. Phosgene gas would cause delayed pulmonary edema. Men would seem fine immediately after exposure, then collapse hours later as their lungs filled with liquid. Mustard gas caused chemical burns on any exposed skin. Eyes would blister and swell shut. Lungs would blister internally. Victims would vomit blood, lose their sight, and asphyxiate slowly. Gas masks were issued, but they only worked if they were put on in time. The first indication of a gas attack was often the smell, and by the time a soldier smelled the gas, he had already inhaled it. Men who survived gas attacks were left with permanent lung damage, blindness, and disfigurement. They were not counted as dead, so they were not counted as casualties in the traditional sense. They were reclassified as medical discharges and removed from the battlefield statistics. Hospitals behind the lines were filled with gas victims who could not breathe without assistance, could not see, and could not speak because their throats had been burned away. The wards were kept separate from other patients because the sight of gas casualties was considered detrimental to morale. Photographers were not allowed in gas wards. Journalists were not allowed to interview gas victims. The public knew that gas was being used. They did not know what it did. The ninth truth involves battlefield executions. Soldiers were executed by their own side for cowardice, desertion, and insubordination. The executions were not rare. They were systemic. British forces executed 306 soldiers during the war. French forces executed more than 600. German and Russian numbers are incomplete, but estimates run into the thousands. The process was bureaucratic. A soldier would be accused, tried by court-martial, and sentenced to death. The sentence would be carried out by firing squad, using men from the condemned soldier's own unit. The logic was that it reinforced discipline and reminded the other soldiers what happened to cowards. The executions were carried out at dawn in view of the troops, with the body left on display as a warning. Many of the men executed were suffering from shell shock. Their medical records documented symptoms of psychological trauma, but shell shock was not recognized as a legitimate condition by military courts. A soldier who refused to advance because he was paralyzed by fear was not sick, he was a coward. A soldier who wandered away from his post because his mind had fractured was not injured. He was a deserter. The distinction was legal, not medical. Doctors would testify that a man was unfit for duty. The court would rule that he was fit for execution. The executions continued until the end of the war. After the war, the records were sealed. Families were told their sons had been killed in action. They were not told their sons had been shot by their own officers for crimes that would later be recognized as symptoms of trauma. The 10th truth involves what happened to wounded men in no man's land. Soldiers who were wounded during an attack but not killed outright would lie in no man's land until they died or were recovered. Recovery was not guaranteed. Stretcher bearers only went into no man's land at night, and only when the tactical situation allowed. Wounded men would lie in the open for hours or days. They would call for help. They would beg. They would scream. The men in the trenches could hear them. Orders prohibited rescue attempts during daylight because it would draw fire and create more casualties. The wounded men understood this. They would stop calling for help. They would stop screaming. The silence was worse than the noise. Soldiers knew that silence meant the wounded had either died or given up. Some wounded men would shoot themselves rather than wait. Others would lie quietly and bleed to death. The worst cases were men wounded in the abdomen. Abdominal wounds were slow deaths. The intestines would spill out and infection would set in. The men would remain conscious for hours, fully aware that they were dying. Morphine was only available at aid stations. Stretcher bearers carried supplies, but not enough for every casualty. Decisions were made about who received morphine and who did not. Men who were obviously dying did not receive morphine. Men who might survive did. The logic was sound. The morphine supply was limited. Wasting it on men who would die anyway made no sense. The men who were denied morphine understood the logic. They did not forgive it. The 11th truth involves trench raids. Raids were small-scale attacks designed to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, or destroy enemy positions. They were conducted at night by specially selected troops armed with knives, clubs, and grenades. Firearms were often left behind because they were too loud. The raids were silent, brutal, and intimate. Men would crawl into enemy trenches and kill whoever they found with as little noise as possible. The killing was done with trench knives, which were sharpened steel blades designed to puncture and slash. Clubs were used to crush skulls. Entrenching tools, which were small shovels, were sharpened and used as axes. The goal was not to fight. The goal was to kill quickly and quietly. Raiders would return with prisoners, intelligence, and sometimes trophies. Ears, fingers, and teeth were taken as proof of kills. This was not official policy, but it was not discouraged. Officers understood that men who conducted raids needed an outlet for the psychological stress, and taking trophies provided that outlet. The trophies were traded, displayed, and kept as souvenirs. After the war, veterans would sometimes show their collections to friends and family. The practice stopped when it became clear that civilians found it disturbing. The trophies were disposed of. The practice was not discussed. The 12th truth involves what happened to horses. Horses were used for transportation, artillery movement, and cavalry charges. Millions of horses were shipped to the front. Most of them died. Horses cannot wear gas masks. When gas attacks occurred, the horses would panic, inhale the gas, and die in the same manner as unprotected soldiers. Their lungs would fill with fluid, and they would drown. Artillery fire killed horses in large numbers. A single shell could kill a dozen horses if they were grouped together. The bodies were left where they fell because there was no infrastructure for disposing of horse carcasses on that scale. In some sectors, dead horses lined the roads in piles. They decomposed, attracted flies, and created additional health hazards. Soldiers were ordered to move the horses, but there was nowhere to move them to. Burial required labor and time that were not available. The horses were eventually pushed into shell craters or ravines and covered with lime. The smell persisted for months. Horses that were not killed outright in combat often died from exhaustion, starvation, or disease. Veterinary care existed, but the priority was equipment, not animals. A horse that could no longer pull a cart was shot and replaced. The replacement process was efficient. Horses were shipped to the front in trains, unloaded, worked until they died, and replaced with new horses from the same supply chain. The system functioned without interruption for 4 years. The 13th truth involves the use of flamethrowers. Flamethrowers were introduced as a terror weapon. The device sprayed burning oil across a distance of 20 to 30 meters. The oil would stick to whatever it touched and continue burning. Soldiers hit by flamethrowers did not die quickly. The oil would ignite their uniforms, their skin, and their hair. They would burn alive, screaming, while the fire consumed them. Water did not extinguish the oil. Soldiers would run, trying to escape the flames, and the movement would spread the fire across their bodies. Men hit by flamethrowers would sometimes jump into water-filled shell craters, but the oil would float on the surface and continue burning. The use of flamethrowers was legal under the laws of war, but soldiers on both sides considered it a weapon that crossed a moral line. Flamethrower operators were not taken prisoner. When they were captured, they were executed on the spot, often by being burned alive with their own equipment. This was understood and accepted by the men who operated flamethrowers. They knew that if they were captured, they would die badly. They did it anyway. The psychological profile of flamethrower operators was studied after the war. The conclusion was that they were not significantly different from other soldiers. They had simply accepted a role that required them to burn other human beings alive, and they performed that role until they were killed. The 14th truth involves what shell shock actually was. Shell shock was the term used to describe a range of psychological conditions caused by combat stress. Symptoms included tremors, paralysis, mutism, blindness, deafness, and complete psychological collapse. Men with shell shock would shake uncontrollably. They would lose the ability to speak. They would curl into a fetal position and stop responding to external stimuli. The condition was not understood during the war. Early theories suggested it was caused by the physical concussion of shell explosions, hence the name. Later research determined it was a psychological response to sustained trauma. The military response was inconsistent. Some shell shock victims were sent to hospitals. Others were court-martialed. The determining factor was often whether the officer in charge believed the condition was real. Doctors who treated shell shock patients used methods that would later be considered torture. Electric shock therapy was common. The theory was that if a soldier had lost the ability to speak or walk due to psychological trauma, applying painful electric shocks would force the mind to restore function. The treatment worked in some cases. In other cases, it made the condition worse. Soldiers who did not respond to treatment were sent back to the front or discharged as malingerers. The records show thousands of cases of soldiers diagnosed with shell shock who were returned to combat and killed within weeks. The records also show that officers were aware this would happen and sent them anyway. The 15th truth involves the food. Rations in the trenches were inadequate in both quantity and quality. The standard British ration included hardtack biscuits, canned meat, and tea. The hardtack was so hard it could break teeth. Soldiers would soak it in water or tea to make it edible. The canned meat was a substance called bully beef, which was processed corned beef that had been cooked, canned, and shipped to the front. It was nutritionally adequate, but universally despised. The taste was described as metallic and greasy. Soldiers ate it because there was nothing else. Fresh food was available behind the lines, but rarely reached the trenches. The supply system prioritized ammunition over food. When transport was limited, food shipments were delayed or cancelled. Soldiers in the front line would go days without hot meals. They would eat cold bully beef from the can, chew hardtack, and drink water that tasted like chlorine because it had been chemically treated to prevent disease. Malnutrition was widespread. Vitamin deficiencies caused scurvy, night blindness, and other conditions that reduced combat effectiveness. The malnutrition was documented in medical reports but not addressed because fixing it would have required a logistical overhaul that was not considered feasible during wartime. Soldiers supplemented their rations by scavenging, trading with locals, or eating rats. Rat meat was described as greasy but edible. There are documented cases of entire units surviving on rats for weeks when supply lines were cut. The 16th truth involves the role of military chaplains. Chaplains were assigned to units to provide spiritual support and conduct burial services. In practice, they spent most of their time burying the dead. The volume of dead exceeded the capacity of chaplains to provide individual services. Mass graves were dug, and bodies were buried in batches. Chaplains would read a single prayer over dozens of corpses at once. The prayers were shortened to save time. Full funeral rites were reserved for officers. Enlisted men received abbreviated services or no service at all. Chaplains documented this in their personal diaries, many of which were published after the war. They described standing over pits filled with bodies, reading prayers that felt meaningless, and then moving on to the next pit. Some chaplains broke down. Some lost their faith. Some continued functioning by treating the work as a job rather than a spiritual duty. The psychological toll on chaplains was significant, but it was not addressed because chaplains were expected to provide support to others, not require it themselves. Chaplains who requested relief were reassigned to rear areas, where they continued conducting services for men who had been evacuated. The work did not stop. The dead continued to accumulate. The 17th truth involves what happened to the wounded at aid stations. Aid stations were located just behind the front lines, within range of artillery. They were marked with red crosses, but the markings were not always respected. Shells would hit aid stations, killing the wounded and the medical staff. The wounded arrived at aid stations on stretchers, in groups, often without identification. Triage was conducted by medical officers who had seconds to decide who would receive treatment and who would be left to die. Men with abdominal wounds were usually left to die. Men with head wounds were usually left to die. Men with limb injuries were treated if the limb could be saved. If the limb could not be saved, it was amputated. Amputations were performed without anesthetic when supplies ran out. The patient would be held down by orderlies while the surgeon cut through flesh and bone with a saw. The procedure took minutes. The screaming could be heard across the aid station. Men waiting for treatment would hear the screaming and know what was coming. Some would try to leave. They would be restrained and brought back. The amputated limbs were thrown into pits outside the aid station. The pits would fill, and new pits would be dug. Photographs exist of these pits. They were not published during the war. The 18th truth involves the use of soldiers as test subjects. Gas masks, protective equipment, and decontamination procedures were tested on soldiers without their consent. The tests were conducted by exposing soldiers to gas in controlled environments to determine the effectiveness of protective measures. Soldiers were ordered into gas chambers wearing different types of masks. Gas was released. The soldiers were observed to see how long the masks remained effective. Some masks failed. The soldiers inside would begin coughing, vomiting, and collapsing. They were removed and treated, but the exposure was real and the damage was permanent. The tests were justified as necessary for improving equipment, and they were. The data collected saved lives. But the men used to collect that data were not volunteers. They were ordered to participate, and they had no choice. Similar tests were conducted on the effects of blast concussion, chemical burns, and cold weather injuries. The results were documented in medical journals that were classified until decades after the war. The soldiers who participated were not compensated. They were not informed of the long-term health effects. Many of them died from conditions related to the testing, and their deaths were recorded as combat casualties. The 19th truth involves what winter did to the trenches. Winter in the trenches was not cold. It was freezing. Temperatures dropped below zero. The mud froze into ridges that were impossible to walk on. Soldiers could not dig new trenches because the ground was too hard. Water in the trenches froze into ice, and soldiers stood on the ice for days. Frostbite was epidemic. Toes, fingers, ears, and noses would freeze, turn black, and fall off. Men would wake up to find that their fingers had fallen off during the night. The digits would be lying in the bottom of the trench, and the stumps would be black with necrosis. Frostbite casualties were treated the same as trench foot casualties. The dead tissue was cut away, and the soldier was sent back to the line if he could still hold a rifle. Hypothermia killed soldiers who fell asleep on sentry duty. They would be found frozen to death in the morning, still standing in position. The bodies were left in place until they could be moved, which was often days later. Winter also meant that the corpses in no man's land were preserved by the cold. They did not decompose. They froze solid, and they remained frozen until spring, when they would thaw and begin rotting again. The cycle repeated every year. The 20th truth involves the use of soldiers in medical experiments without ethical oversight. Military doctors conducted research on wound treatment, infection control, and surgical techniques using wounded soldiers as subjects. The research was not optional. Soldiers who were wounded were treated using experimental methods, whether they consented or not. New surgical techniques were tested on men who would have survived using conventional methods. Some of the experiments worked. Some did not. The soldiers who died during experimental procedures were recorded as having died from their wounds, not from the treatment. The distinction was semantic. Autopsies were performed on soldiers who died in hospitals to study the effects of gas exposure, infection, and trauma. The autopsies were conducted without family consent because the bodies were military property. Organs were removed, preserved, and sent to research institutions. The families were told their sons had been buried. They were not told their sons had been dissected. The research produced advances in trauma surgery, infection control, and prosthetics. The cost was borne by soldiers who had no say in how their bodies were used. The 21st truth involves the construction of cemeteries. Battlefield cemeteries were built during the war to manage the volume of dead. The cemeteries were not symbolic. They were logistical necessities. Bodies were buried in rows, marked with wooden crosses. The crosses included name, rank, and unit when the information was available. When it was not, the cross read, "Unknown Soldier." The percentage of unknown soldiers varied by sector, but in some areas it exceeded 50%. The bodies were often too damaged to identify. Personal effects were lost, destroyed, or stolen. Identification tags were made of metal, but they corroded or were blown off by shell fire. The result was thousands of graves marked as unknown. After the war, the wooden crosses were replaced with stone markers. The cemeteries were landscaped, photographed, and opened to the public. They became symbols of sacrifice and remembrance. What they actually represented was the industrial processing of mass death on a scale that required dedicated burial infrastructure. The cemeteries were efficient. They were well organized. They were a solution to a logistical problem. The 22nd truth involves what happened to soldiers who surrendered. Surrendering in trench warfare was dangerous because the act of surrendering made a soldier visible, and visibility drew fire. Soldiers attempting to surrender would climb out of their trench with their hands raised. They would be shot by their own side for desertion or by the enemy, because surrender was not always accepted. The decision to accept a surrender was made by individual soldiers in the moment, and the decision was influenced by factors that had nothing to do with military law. If a unit had just taken casualties from a gas attack, they were less likely to accept surrenders. If a soldier had just watched his friend die, he was less likely to take prisoners. The result was that many soldiers attempting to surrender were killed. This was understood by everyone involved. Soldiers knew that trying to surrender might result in being shot. They tried anyway because the alternative was staying in the trench and dying there. Prisoners who were taken were marched to the rear, interrogated, and sent to prison camps. The camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and disease-ridden. Thousands of prisoners died from typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition. The deaths were recorded but not investigated. The camps were operating within the accepted standards of the time. The 23rd truth involves the role of alcohol. Alcohol was issued to soldiers as a ration. Rum was standard in the British Army. Wine was standard in the French Army. The alcohol was distributed before attacks to reduce fear and increase aggression. Soldiers were given enough rum to make them drunk, but not incapacitated. The logic was that drunk soldiers were more willing to climb out of the trench and advance into machine gun fire. The policy worked. Drunk soldiers were statistically more likely to follow orders to attack. They were also more likely to be killed because their reaction times were slower and their judgment was impaired. The use of alcohol as a combat enhancer was official policy, documented in supply records and tactical manuals. Officers were aware that they were sending drunk men into combat. The decision was considered acceptable because the alternative was sober men who refused to advance. Alcoholism was widespread among soldiers and officers. Men drank to cope with fear, trauma, and boredom. The supply of alcohol was steady because it was prioritized alongside ammunition and food. Soldiers who became too drunk to function were disciplined, but the discipline was rarely severe because everyone understood why they were drinking. The 24th truth involves the use of disease as a weapon. Both sides understood that disease could incapacitate enemy forces more effectively than bullets. Contaminating water supplies was considered but not widely implemented because the risk of self-contamination was too high. However, corpses were sometimes deliberately left in areas where the enemy would have to occupy them, knowing that the corpses would spread disease. Dead animals were thrown into enemy water sources. Latrines were positioned uphill from enemy positions so that runoff would contaminate their trenches. These actions were not coordinated at the strategic level. They were field expedients adopted by individual units because they worked. The result was that disease rates in some sectors were artificially elevated by deliberate contamination. The practice was never officially acknowledged because it violated the laws of war, but the laws of war were not enforced in the trenches. What mattered was what worked, and disease worked. The 25th truth involves the fact that none of this was hidden at the time. The soldiers knew. The officers knew. The generals knew. The politicians knew. Reports were filed, read, and archived. Photographs were taken and stored. Testimony was recorded and classified. The information existed. It was simply not distributed to the public because the public was needed to support the war, and the truth would not support the war. The truth was that trench warfare had become a self-sustaining system of human attrition that operated according to bureaucratic logic and industrial efficiency. The system did not need to be moral. It needed to function, and it did function. For 4 years, millions of men were fed into trenches, processed through combat, and converted into casualties at a rate that was predictable, measurable, and sustainable. The war ended because the system exhausted the available supply of men, not because anyone decided it was wrong. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. The trenches were abandoned. The bodies were counted. The records were filed. And the next generation was born into a world where this had already happened once, which meant it could happen again, and the infrastructure was already in place.